The next couple of chapters aren't favorites of mine, and for pretty obvious reasons, in my estimation. This one is on racial inequities in sport or in life, and I have a hard time with that because I truly don't see why it is at this point in 2018 we're still dealing with racial issues. I would have thought that we would have advanced past that. And also, as a preview for what the next chapter will be, you can see in the second bullet point here that it wasn't just white people, it was white males. So there were no females involved in sport either until the recent decades. So hopefully we can continue to evolve and advance, and at some point there'll be classes like this taught where there won't have to be discussions about racial issues or issues between the sexes. You can read here that it the book at least has the opinion that one of the reasons the white people didn't want to play against those of other races was that they didn't want their superiority to be disproved. And that's why people like Cool Papa Bell and John Henry Lloyd and the likes were never allowed to play against the white superstars of their time, people like, as it mentions here, Ty Cobb and Rogers Hornsby. The second bullet point here brings another issue to light. On the rare occasions that there were teams that had people of different cultures and different races on it, they had to find separate housing when they traveled. There were restaurants that wouldn't allow people of color to eat in them, and so they would have to find separate places for people of color to even just get a meal or something. There was a lot more to it than just saying they weren't allowed to play sports. This slide about basketball is something of significance for those of us who live in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Basketball has been called the ultimate urban sport, but it's also a sport that is the sport of choice for people in rural areas, and it mentions specifically here Kansas, Kentucky, and Indiana. I think the reason for that is, and the reason that basketball is a sport that many people go to, is that you can shoot baskets all on your own. You don't need teammates or somebody to play against or whatever. You can't play football on your own. It's much more challenging. It's harder to play baseball or even to throw baseball on your own unless you have some help. Basketball is a sport that can be more individualized, and I think that's why it is that people choose basketball when they live in these specific settings. I also would like to point out to you that while I do not want to downgrade what people of color went through in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, I would also like to point out to you that when I read this, I do notice there are many similarities to what white people in cultures like Eastern Kentucky, Appalachian cultures, where people just hear you talk and immediately start deducting IQ points, have gone through a lot of similar things to people of color. Now, they were allowed to eat in restaurants and those sort of things, and they would have been allowed to play Major League Baseball or in the NBA or whatever. But I do see some similarities. Now, it's not nearly the extreme. I want to make sure you understand that I'm not trying to degrade or downgrade what those of color went through. But there are some similarities to what people of Appalachia deal with when they deal with people outside of our culture. This is an interesting point here that many schools or teams do have people of color mixed in with whites, but very often they split based on the sport that they play, which is why in the classroom we give examples of positions in sports in particular where you very rarely see people of color or you very rarely see white people play. The most common example given of white players would be on the football field would be as a receiver or a defensive back. You do see those, but they're very, very rare. And there are other issues where you don't see many people of color. And let's talk about the Olympics for an example here. If you watch the Olympics, you'll see a good mix of white people and you'll see a good mix of people of color. But notice the separation. Rarely do you see white people competing in track, and rarely do you see people of color competing in sports like swimming and diving. They are still divided uh, along racial lines in many ways, and I don't really know how to explain that to you. I'm just simply pointing out the fact that it seems to be true. Now, occasionally you will see a black swimmer, occasionally you'll see a white sprinter, but for the most part, there is a division there. Jackie Robinson has given a lot of credit for integrating our society. And while we don't want to downgrade his importance, it's it's important to point out that Jackie Robinson wasn't the first person of color to play Major League Baseball. He was just the first in about a 40-year period. Also, he wasn't the first to play pro sports in the United States. As you can see here, there were four African Americans who played in the National Football League a year before Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. Also, but let me point this out to you. That's the main difference in our culture today and back in the 1940s. Baseball dominated along with horse racing and boxing. Football, basketball, those sports were secondary, and it's hard for us to wrap our mind around that at this point, the way our society flocks to football so much. But I think we're starting to see a little bit of a swing in that as well. The National Basketball Association clearly takes on a tremendous amount of significance, more so than Major League Baseball, but not so in the 1940s. And I think that's one of the reasons Jackie Robinson is so credited with integrating sport in our society. Now, notice that it says that about 65% of the players in the National Football League are African American, and only about 15% of Major League Baseball players are African American. And you also have to keep in mind that when you watch baseball games, you may see a significant more number of people of color playing them, but you also have to figure in how many of those people come from the Latin America countries like the Dominican Republic, like Cuba, and some of those, Venezuela and those sort of countries. Those aren't considered African Americans, simply the fact that they're not American.